Hello, this is Professor Hendricks again here. Talk a little bit about Chapter 8. I'm going to cover sort of again the personal PowerPoints I've added in. Real briefly, so start out with some of the major geographic qualities. No mountain backbone. So what that means is there's not like one mountain range like the Rockies or the Andes or the Himalayas or the Hindu Kush Alps, etc. There are, of course, Mount Kilimanjaro, most famously, some very high mountain peaks near the equator in Kenya and all of that. The African continent is one of those very resource rich in terms of gold and cobalt and diamonds and oil and water. British Geographical Survey years ago found basically just not an ocean, but tons of water underneath the surface, perfect for potable water, perfect for drinking. The biggest reason is the next point there on this is on slide 2, sorry, on the PowerPoint pack, is there's a lot of ineffective government leadership. Some of that is the legacy of the colonial experience in Africa. Some of that's probably 4 centuries at least, and that's just counting the transatlantic slave trade of a brain drain, human resource. Slavery, in addition to just being objectively evil in and of itself, is also a massive brain drain, manpower, human resource drain on the continent. And then you throw in within the intracontinental slavery, which has been going on for millennia on the continent, and that's not even counting the slave trade towards the Middle East and India and other places as well. One of the legacies of that has been ineffective government leadership, not in all places, as with all things. There are some generalities and there are some bright spots as well. Poorly drawn boundaries, and really is the other sort of probably the near legacy of colonialism, similar to what we talked about in Central and South America, similar to what we see in actually Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, and we'll see it again in Southeast Asia. We saw it in the Middle East. Colonial powers drawing maps to sort of please their own interests, and in many cases intentionally dividing up people groups, language groups, religious groups to sort of divide and conquer, and all of those kinds of things. And of course, when the countries, the powers leave, as they did in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s, the lines on the map that you see today in a map of Africa, and you see them in the maps attached to this PowerPoint, they don't really recognize the reality on the ground. Right now, they'd have to be renegotiated, so redoing them would take a while, but that's exacerbates some of the issues there as well. As we'll see too, and I don't know that I put a link, I think there's a link or a chart on the publisher provided PowerPoints. There is some economic growth in the area too. So again, I had a student years ago from Rwanda, and she sent me a link. This tells you how long ago it was. A college student was on Facebook, like 2007 or 8 or 9, somewhere in there, late aughts. Anyway, there was a Facebook group called The Africa You Don't See, and so she was a member of this. She sent me the link, and it was a picture of tons of photographs uploaded by people from Africa, from sub-Saharan African countries mostly, of middle-class residential neighborhoods, cars, some wealthy, some middle-class, quote-unquote normal, more sort of looking like a suburban. And to just basically look, not all of the country is HIV, AIDS, malaria, kids in Super Bowl losing team T-shirts and all the sort of cliches and stereotypes and things like that. So there are countries that have been growing in terms of their economics, as the West and China and some others have maybe been more targeted, smarter in investment. As some African countries have sort of taken over more independence, obviously, and become more independent. There's some economic growth opportunities there as well, not just tied to foreign powers and all that. So the chapter will deal with a lot of those, of course. On slide 3 there, Erta Ale is the largest ongoing lava lake in the world. There's 3 of them, this sort of perpetual lava lakes. One is in the DR Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's hard to get to because of the Congolese situation is dire. And then the other one is in Antarctica, which we'll talk about when we get to the end there in chapter 13 at the end of the semester. The Ethiopian one has been here and there hard to get to because of sometimes the government has been troubled, we'll say civil war. But anyway, so Erta Ale gives you an idea there. This was a photograph of it in slide 2 and a sort of a video clip of it there. PowerPoint slide 5, I gave you a couple of maps of sort of pre-colonial African kingdoms. So again, not oftentimes obviously studying the United States unless you take, some sort of African studies or something along those lines. But, the great Ghana, Songhai, Mali, the Gold Coast, the great Zimbabwe, the Zulu, there's the northern sort of Sudanese, Nubians, Cushites, Ethiopia. I mean, if you go back to, say, Bible times in the Old Testament, it's not just Egypt, though, of course, obviously, if you're somewhat familiar with the narrative of the Old Testament, Egypt, of course, plays a huge role. But Libya is mentioned, Cush and Nubia, which are South Egypt, South Sudan, basically. Ethiopians are mentioned in the Old Testament, New Testament. Obviously, they go back way, back before that, even, of course, outside a biblical narrative. But great, great cultures. There's some ruins and things like that. So I put some photographs there as well of some certain, kinds of tribes and ruins of cities and temples and all of that. So that are there. So in some of their historical view, they were, and that's where the lines on the maps in today's world. So you want to see Ghana, and then you look on the map and you see this little chunk of a country, which is small relatively. But if you look at the historical, the Ghanaian culture, well beyond that, right? But Britain comes, France comes, they draw lines on maps, and that's and they don't again recognize the reality on the ground. Some of the reason there's not a huge amount of ruins is in some ways they didn't crack all the same math problems and architectural and engineering problems that the Egyptians did, the Persians, the Greeks, the Chinese, and others, for whatever reason, right? There's not a lot of written history going back sort of into what we would call ancient cultures. There is some, like I said, in Ethiopia, Abyssinia, obviously Egypt, and some of those. We'll talk a little bit about colonialism, sort of 1.0 and 2.0. The first one is sort of what we all study in school, what I studied in school when I was a kid, sort of transatlantic slave trade, for which the United States accounts for about like 8%. We'll look at that map here in a second. And then we'll look at a little bit at post-colonial independence in post-World War II, which sort of left sort of varying levels of organization and models for success. So that's from slide 6. Slide 7, I gave you some photos of some landmarks, some historical relics. Slide 8, and then slide 9, I just found that interesting. I came across here, it's called the Battle of, I think it's Waina Daga is how it's pronounced, but that's, who knows, that's Abyssinian through Texas through English. And I came across this a few years ago on one of those this day in history kind of thing, February 21st apparently. Anyway, a Portuguese army and an Ethiopian army, both Christians, one Catholic, one African or Ethiopian Orthodox, are fighting an Ottoman, an Islamic army seeking to incur down south. So I just never heard of that before. There wasn't a large trend of Portuguese and Ethiopian friendship, I wouldn't say. The Ethiopians, or excuse me, the Portuguese do bear a large brunt of guilt and shame for what went on in Africa in the next 400 or 500 years. But there were some cultural ties. Ethiopia is an interesting country. Until it was defeated by Italy in a war in 1935, it's not really officially colonized, and even the Italians weren't really able to sort of fully colonize it. So it seems in each place there's like a continent, there's a place that seems resistant to that. So Ethiopia, like Egypt, has had a very strong sort of cohesive cultural presence in that landmass for millennia. Anyway, so I just found that interesting. You can Google that and read more of that. That's not really part of the geography thing, but that's just part of the history of the continent. Slide 10 gives you a sort of an overview of the international slave trade from Africa into the New World, so-called New World, and also back into the Arabian Peninsula and India. Slide 11 is what I sometimes call 2.0, which refers to the sort of beginnings of modern colonialism. So you have the abolition of slavery for the most part in the United States, obviously after Civil War, and by Britain earlier. And then Germany doesn't become a nation until 1871 or 2. And they're late to the game, right? France has colonies, Britain has colonies, Germany's like, we don't have colonies, we need some colonies. So they have this conference. It's sometimes called the Scramble for Africa, sometimes it's called the Great Partition. I guess officially it's the Berlin Conference. And so they basically look at a map of the world. Okay, where have we not gone, and where, so basically there's two places, Oceania and Micronesia and all those islands out in the South Pacific. We'll talk more about those later. And then Africa. And so they basically do a one for you, one for me, one for you, one for you, one for me divvy up of the map, right? With really no request from Africans to come down and please, colonize us. None of that, obviously. So the first one focused on slaves, and the second one really is a kind of a byproduct also of the economic growth of the Industrial Revolution and the need for markets. You have a, long story short, a surplus of people, quite frankly. There's not enough jobs for all the people. A surplus and a need for raw materials, rubber, oil. If you think about the industrial economy and the belts and hoses and plastics and tires and gasoline and diesel and things that a modern economy needs. And then later on, of course, diamonds and now cobalt and lithium and all those things. Africa has just tons of those resources. And so you get that, where these European countries basically draw up the map and then exploit the countries rather, for the resources. There's a map on page 12 that sort of shows you the original sort of pre-World War I, post-World War I. Germany's off the map by this point because they lose a lot of their colonies after the Treaty of Versailles there. Not enough bad can be said about the Belgian Congo. That's slide 13. I would recommend to you, there's a book called King Leopold's Ghost, about Leopold II, the British monarch, the Belgian monarch, who basically gets the Congo as his personal fiefdom, and just enriches his own personal wealth. I mean, I guess the country of Belgium benefited a lot, and of course, a lot of rich Belgians benefited personally in investing in these companies. But it's a barn burner of a book. It really just lays a lot at the feet of King Leopold. There's a book, if maybe you've read Joseph Conrad's novella, The Heart of Darkness, which is also set in the Democratic Republic of Congo. By today's standards, it's oftentimes seen as sort of a, impolite book or whatever. I don't really believe in canceling books, especially great books. It's a good read. It's damning of the Belgian Congo. So is it written in a language I wouldn't write today? Yes. Is it a hagiography of King Leopold and Belgium? No, it's not. It's a pretty damning look at the injustice and atrocities going on in the early 1900s in the Congo. I don't know if I put a book list up. If I didn't, I'll put it up. There's another book I read this last summer called Red Cobalt, cobalt red. It's about China exploiting the Congo for cobalt. Cobalt is one of those rare earth metals used in cell phone batteries. So you have this sort of consistent, really over the last few centuries, of European powers and now China also exploiting the natural resources of the continent. On slide 14 and 15 and 16, you get kind of the three basic kinds of colonialism. And again, Africa is a microcosm for a lot of things. So the first one is direct rule colonialism. France, Germany do a lot of that. There's France in Algeria, which is obviously north of the Saharan, but a good example of that. But in Senegal and lots of other places, French is still the lingua franca of a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. French food, French wine, French culture, French language. If you're going to work on the African continent, it's still beneficial to learn French. A friend of mine just is in getting a security clearance. He's going to be in an intelligence type job. He learned French. One of his destinations potential would have been sub-Saharan Africa. That's not anything secret. That's his parents told me that, but that's how Francophone still is a big thing in that part of the world. The French policy would have been, so for example, Algeria was actually a French department, like a state. So if you're like Albert Camus, the author who wrote The Plague and the Stranger and The Myth of Sisyphus and some other things, he's a Frenchman, a Caucasian Frenchman born in Algeria. He's a citizen of France, not because he's white, but because he's born in Algeria, and that's a French state, right? That's what the French sort of promised. If you take us on, allow us to take you on, we will make you French, right? And of course, they never paid off on that promise as well. But direct rule means that they didn't allow locals to rule. They brought in French people in colonial offices to then basically run things. So when the French leave, all the people, not all, but most of the people who know how to run the electric grids, the water systems, the trains, the levers of government have sort of up and left and gone back to France, right? So as oftentimes you'll see former French colonies really start off on a wrong foot. The Germans, again, probably the less said the better. They had Somalia, they had Namibia prior to World War I. They committed a genocide there in the early teens of about 1 million Namibians, well before that word was even part of the nomenclature. I read another good book a few years ago, and my author's names are just killing me today. It's called African Kaiser, and it's about this German general who basically ran the German colonies during World War I, and it sort of references that aspect. The British, on slide 15, used a thing called indirect rule, and this is why former British colonies often, not always, but often start off on somewhat better foot. So the British used locals, and then they would actually educate some of those locals, send them back to Oxford and Durham and Sussex and Essex and their universities, and then send them back home. The British used local languages oftentimes to rule. I mean, they did put the English common law system and English language on top of that, but they also learned to use, if you read colonial stories, it's amazing to me how some of these British soldiers learned so many dialects of local languages. Don't get me wrong, I'm not putting a gloss on British colonialism. It's not good in many ways. I guess an upside, if you will, is by using locals to run police, run trains, run power grids, water systems, educational systems. When the British did finally pull up stakes and leave, there was a class of, I guess, public servants, for lack of a better word, technicians, technocrats, bureaucrats, people who could run things. Now so you get Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, all of them had some troubles, to say the least, starting out, but they've started and have been more stable over the years. than some others, right? You can say the same somewhat for India, Pakistan, other former British colonies. That sort of goes back to how they ran their colonies. So lots of bad things, not quite as bad as maybe, well, the Belgians and the Portuguese kind of stand out as the worst of the worst. I would argue the Germans too, but we don't have a huge sample size because they weren't, after losing World War I, they were pretty much out of the colonies game for a while. And then the Portuguese and the Belgians, and I've already talked about them a little bit as well, basically just are sort of what's called exploitation colonialism, meaning they're just there solely to exploit. Again, I'm not going to put a gloss on Spanish and French and British, but it's still paternalistic and racist and all that. I hate to say, but they're at least telling themselves, we're here to make this place better, right? We're going to make you French. Now that's very arrogant to say that, but in doing what? Well, the French think being French is awesome, so we're going to make you French. We're going to make you better. The British say what? We've got the British common law system. It is the best system in the world. And as a lawyer, I'm partial to the common law system. The American version is even better than that. But, right, we're going to educate you. We're going to do this or that. We're going to bring you religion. We're going to do these kind of things. So again, it's very paternalistic, very sort of coercive. The Portuguese and the Belgians, they don't even try that. They don't even pay lips. Well, the Belgians pay somewhat lip service to that, but they're there to take, to only take, right? Where the Belgians send a handful of Belgians relatively, and then just use abject terror and force and violence to basically run the place and strip it of rubber and resources and all of that. The Portuguese are the last to leave, probably because they're one of the poorer countries in the world. They do have a kind of a fascist dictatorship into the mid to late 20th century, kind of like the Spanish. So they're the first to get there, and they're the last to leave. And when they leave, they take everything. Like they take the wiring, they take the toilets, they take the sinks. They take everything when they leave. I mean, it's very much an exploitative. All colonialism is exploitative, of course, but there's sort of the essence of exploitation. I don't know how else to phrase it. And then I'll end this one here. So the other thing here is 18. I put a link to a documentary. And if you're interested in Rwanda at all, and I know the Rwandan genocide, I don't know how old you guys are, but happened in the 90s. So most of y'all, if not all of y'all, weren't born then. And Shake Hands with the Devil is the name of a book by a guy named Romeo Dallaire, Dallaire. He was a Canadian general in charge of the UN mission in Rwanda. And he's there with some weapons. He's there with 2,000 soldiers. They've got some armored vehicles. And basically, he just has to sit and watch these two people groups go at each other, and then watch the sort of genocide that unfolds, because one group is very much a majority and the other group is not. And the UN just kind of sits there wringing its hands and umming and ahhing and not really doing anything. And this guy, and so the documentary, he goes back to Rwanda 10 years after, in 2004, and he's filled with guilt. And I think later on he's actually diagnosed with PTSD because he had to see all these people just butchered with machetes and all that. So anyway, there's a book, which is kind of a memoir, and then the documentary is based on the book. To tell you how murky it all is, I don't know if there's a movie called Hotel Rwanda with, he plays War Machine on Avenger, whatever that guy's name is. I cannot remember his name. He's a Rwandan who runs a hotel, who, in the movie anyway, harbors a lot of people. Well, in real life, that guy is actually tried by the International Tribunal for War Crimes in Rwanda because he's a butcher. But at the time, everyone thinks he's a hero, right? Only after the investigation does it come out. So anyway, so that's just a very broad overview, of course. Later on, there's stuff in there about malaria, which is the largest killer on the continent, HIV/AIDS, sleeping sickness. There's another link to a little documentary on DDT, which is a banned pesticide in the United States and in Western Europe, but they call it the magic powder because it kills mosquitoes like silver bullets kill werewolves. I mean, it's just a magic. You put it. You don't have to spray all of it. You just aerosolize it, put it in the corners of the windows, and it like is a barrier to mosquitoes at night. So they've actually authorized its use in sub-Saharan Africa because malaria is such a killer disease there, and it shouldn't have to be that. So anyway, y'all have a good week, and again, remember there's a quiz only, no written assignment, and I will talk to y'all on video next week. Thank you.